Over the months of August and September, Hot Topics will be following a series called Can Christians? In this series, Hot Topics will once again invite guests to hear from them on a range of somewhat taboo and controversial topics. In this series, we will not be prescribing specific answers to questions such as, can Christians have sex before marriage? Can Christians drink alcohol? Can Christians have a relationship with ancestors? Can Christians get tattoos? And many more. Instead, we will seek to explore these topics and equip you with the necessary tools to contemplate and respond ethically to taboo topics. Your host team for this series, Colonial, Rebecca Rivas, and Ilse Werle. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Hot Topics. It's really great to have you joining us again. We are really excited to have you joining us as we start the conversation tonight about, can Christians have a relationship with ancestors? It's a topic that's been quite controversial in the church in some spaces, and it's a topic that's been around for many years. Sometimes we find that there's a big misunderstanding about what it actually means to have a relationship with ancestors. And so tonight we want to unpack what it really means and answer the question, or equip ourselves with tools of how do we explore the question of, can Christians have a relationship with ancestors? And so as we start the conversation tonight, I'm going to ask our guests just to introduce themselves and ourselves as well. So if we can start with you.
Thank you. I'm Sfiso Kuzwayo, a Methodist minister, but also a person who has a very great interest in issues of ancestors and African traditional religions.
And once again, I'm Mikhael, part of the Hot Topics team, part of the team here at Grace Point. But today I come more not as part of the team, but rather as someone who has an interest in African religions and traditions, but also as a young person who has, on various stages, struggled with the tension that is created by the misunderstanding of our relationship with ancestors.
Thanks, Louis. It's great to have you guys joining us. Hi, everyone. My name is Ilse, and I'm part of the Hot Topics team here at Grace Point.
Hi, everyone. My name is Similo Kasangela. I am of the clan Yamahadebe, Timkulu. Now, there's no English translation for that. It's my clan praises. I am an African, and I'm a co-host with Elsa.
Thanks, Similo. So tonight, as we start off the conversation, I don't know about how you guys have experienced it, but my experience around this question of ancestors has been that there's been a great separation between it. It's either been that you are able to observe traditions with ancestors, or you go the Jesus route. There's no in between. That's what I've often found in the church space. So I wanted to ask, as we kick off this conversation tonight, what's your experience been for all of us? What's your experience been around ancestors? And maybe just before that, we ask the question, what do you understand the difference between and the similarities between venerating ancestors, worshiping ancestors, and having a relationship with ancestors?
All right. As I said earlier, I grew up in an African home, and my personal experience, I've never had to live a distinct life. It has always been a combination. And so I never was stuck in a space where I had to either be Christian or be African. So growing up in that way, you then come into a church space and begin to realize that in church politics, people sometimes frown upon your wearing of ispandla, which is the African bracelet. And things like that. Then you begin to also hear sermons that say ancestors or any African traditional practices are demonic in nature. So out of all that, then I ask myself the question, but why are people separating these things? Where is the distinction? That's where my own personal experience comes from. And then as you hear these things that people are saying, you begin to get into the conversation. Are we really worshiping ancestors, or are we respecting them, the word being venerating them? So what does that mean? Basically, one would say to venerate is to give great honor and respect towards something. And that is distinct from worshiping, which is what we do towards God. And incidentally, Africa only knows, when I speak Africa, Southern Africa only knows of one God. So we do not have many gods, therefore worship many different deities. As Umzulu, we only know of Umvelinqangi, the God who was before anything else was. So there's no distinction there.
Thanks, Munguni. So I actually grew up in a context where it wasn't spoken, but it was different. So I actually grew up in a context where, and this is not only in my family space, but in the community that I grew up in. So I grew up in a township in the East Rand, and the culture in the township is very interesting because it's a new culture emerging, but it's not that much of a culture that is rooted in traditional practices. That is in Gauteng, in Gauteng townships. But so it would be something that would be distinct to certain households if they are still very much rooted in their traditional practices. However, what happens in my case is at the age of 15, a traditional healer says they see a light in me. That was the reason I then said, okay, this is a reason for me to start going to church and being intentional in my journey of my first faith formation journey. And I did that because I was naive at that time, and I was thinking to myself, no. Clearly, if a traditional healer says they see a light in me, then I don't want anything to do with that with that kind of stuff. So the best place to run away to is the church. And that's what I thought at that particular moment. However, while I am in church, I begin to understand rather. One, fortunately, I ran to a Roman Catholic church at first. And I say fortunately in this instance, because I then begin, and at that time I went to a Roman Catholic school, so then I began appreciating the idea of saints. But at the very same time, I began asking myself questions around this dichotomy, this false separation between ancestors and God, when saints and God can belong in the same place. I start asking myself questions around that, but also while I'm busy, while I'm growing as a young person who was curious and involved in student politics, I also began to understand the political connotation of this separation. I began to understand the history that this separation came from. I began to understand why it is so important for South African politics, South African historic politics that inform the history of South Africa to demonize ancestors. And that's where my interest actually came from, in trying to understand those things. And then obviously later on along the line, I begin to appreciate the idea of our relationship with ancestors as a space that can help us restore the family space, not only the immediate family space, but the broader family space, along with all the complexes, with all the dynamics that come with that.
Thank you. That's been really interesting to hear from both of you. I think for me, it's kind of been the very traditional Western kind of church where I've grown up in, where it's either or. There's definitely no understanding really of what it means to have a relationship with ancestors. It's always been I think it's unspoken, but it's there. Every church, if you have a relationship with ancestors, it's almost like you engaging in devil worship or idolatry, or it's just not compatible with Christianity. And that's kind of been how I've grown up. And then I started doing a theology degree, and one of my subjects that I did was about exploring our Christian foundations and our African Christian foundations, and exploring how Christianity is actually an African concept and how it's an African religion. It's not brought in, it's just inherent in Africa. And then also exploring African traditional religions and those types of things, and just reading about those things, and then sometimes you hear something from an African traditional religion, and you think, but isn't that similar in Christianity? Isn't that similar in how the Jewish nation worshiped God? And that's kind of started to pickle my interest on this subject. And it's helped me move from a place of saying, it's wrong, I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to know about it, to saying, I want to put my preconceived ideas aside, listen, learn, and then figure out where I stand on this. So that's been my experience about it. I don't know about you, Samilo.
Well, for me, I come from a family where really we are not that so strict in the observance of African tradition, if I can call it that. However, fundamental to the discussion for me is I have my mother, whom I loved dearly, who is no more. Whenever I go home to Matatiele, I go to my mom's grave. I have a conversation with my mother. And that is translated then to the relationship I had with my grandfather and my grandmother. If I get chance to go to the village home, I go to their grave. I have a conversation with them. It is, I think Sifiso for me hit the nail on the head in assisting us define quite distinctively the difference between worship and veneration. And I'm fully aligned to what he shared. And so there is this recognition in me that it cannot be that since my mother is not on this side of life, therefore the relationship is cut. We continue to relate. I feel her presence at times. My mother prayed for us as siblings, you know, and often I would find myself saying, Mom, I believe you are with God. You know, intercede for me before God. It's the point Cloney made of the saints who are with God. You know, it is out of that understanding. So, although I do not strictly come from a family that observes African tradition to the T, but I have that awareness within me. It's not defined by family. I craft it as I go along.
I think it's a very interesting perspective to look at it like that, as it's almost an ongoing relationship. Just because people aren't physically alive with us on this side of heaven, if we want to put it that way, it doesn't mean we lose relationship with it. And I mean, I've been reading a book recently by Nagara and Mofokeng, and they explain that relationship, how we don't worship our ancestors. We continue to have a relationship with them, and we honor, we respect, and we revere them the same way as we do our living relatives. Maybe we can explore some common misconceptions around this idea of ancestors, and how you've, like you said, Samilo, it's maybe not something that you've practiced yourself, but what you've picked up, Sviso, for you in sermons or churches, and in practicing African traditions. Let's hear about that. That'd be great.
I wonder if I'm going to be going directly there, but let me bring these 2 points here and maybe begin that as a base that might get us there easier. There are fundamentals in African livelihood that, one, we would say life does not have a beginning and an end. Life is continuous. As a newborn baby comes onto this space called Earth, they have come from where the rest of my people are at. And when death in this space comes, it's not the end of life, but it's moving back into the space where my people are at, which is a space that is in the presence of God, Umvelingang in our case. Therefore, one, life is continuous. Two, because life is continuous, in whatever we do on this space and time we call earth, we need to keep everybody informed of the things we are doing. We need to have everybody's blessings on this journey. I often say, and the guys would laugh at me when I say, as I sit here, Smilo said it. He called himself Uchadebe and others, clan names that he said are not translatable. As he sits, he represents all those people. As I sit, I represent Okuzwayo and all those people. The same with you. So whatever we do, we need to bring those people in on the journey. So community then becomes the second element, which is very important. Then the third element, which also relates to ancestors on this case, is the issue of hierarchy. When I need something from, well, when my father was alive, or in the traditional sense of the word, when a child needs something, you don't just run to your father, but you go the softer route. Mommy, this is what I need. By the time it gets to your father, it's cushioned such a way that you will get what you want. The same kind of hierarchy and respect works when it comes to issue of prayer and bringing in your other members of the family. You don't go directly to God, but the persons who are closer to where God is are my ancestors. So when I do a report of this is what is happening in the family, and this is what we are planning on doing, it becomes important that you do that in a sacred space in the home where you bring in everybody else and you bring in those who've gone before us. They then take that to the presence of God and present your case. That is the base. And I think from that base, then we can begin to say, how does it relate to today?
Thanks. And I really want to pick up from where Umguni left off. So there is something beautiful that is also how MBT actually helps us understand this relationship that we have with our ancestors. So the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that in that special space that we have set apart as a family to say this is where we all meet, the living and the living dead. In that space, you've got 3 time zones that are already present there. You've got the past that is present in that space. You've got the present that is present. And you've got your ancestors who are in relationship with God. Mbiti also goes on to say, when we understand our ancestors, we also need to understand that they serve as an intermediary between God and human beings. And so therefore, whatever we do for them, when we speak to them, when we ask them for something, the language might not come across as though it is that, but ultimately the ultimate recipient of our pleads, of whatever we ask from our ancestors, the ultimate recipient is God. And so one of the things that has been misunderstood, and maybe I don't know if it's because of language or what, but is that the understanding is when I go into the special place, I've got what some would call umseme in my home space. And I go there very often. And when I am there, the ultimate recipient of everything that I ask for in that space is God. You know, and then I would go on to say, then there are people who would say, but then why do you have to go through your ancestors when Jesus has broken the veil? You know, there's also that argument that often raises. And for me, the pin actually dropped, funny enough, when Malanel was speaking about the family as a hermeneutic sphere. The family as a space of natural learning. The family as a space that is very similar to the Jewish table where the youngest person in the family would stand up and ask and say, why are we doing this? And then the family would retell the story and say, this is what God did for us. It is a space where they are bought into the past of that particular family. And the ethics that would come from that particular space. So remember, ethics belong to a community in the African space. Ethics are not something that an individual would thumbsuck and say, these are my ethics. They belong to the community. And so the ethics that I ascribe to as an individual would come from the family space. The family space is not only the living, but also the living and the dead. And therefore, it is a space of natural learning for my ethics. I draw my ethics from that space. I need to understand, Uguti, Ombele, there are things that they do, there are things that they do not do, and there are reasons we do certain things. For a typical example, without taking too long, is that a silly example is there are things that we still observe at my house where my wife would not be in physical proximity to my father. You know, for someone who's an outsider spectator, they would not understand why, but we've got our reasons, and those are some of the things that inform my ethics, my way of being. But it is a family space where we all gathered, the living and the dead.
Yeah, so I appreciate a very interesting conception you shared, Hloni, about the living and the living dead, which in fact qualifies Sfiso's point about life never ending, life forever continuing. However, then, another question would be, so when we read scripture, for instance, especially those who would find proof texts to approve or disapprove of something, whose sole function really in interacting with text is solely that. And you've begun to introduce us to Christ having paid the price and all of it. So it would be interesting, Sfiso, just for you to add for us how then, amongst other things, we consider the African context in this topic, in the issue of ancestral worship, faith, Africa. I mean, I'm bringing in the point of context into the discussion.
Christianity is an interesting bag of, call it whatever you want to call it, in this way. One, it was introduced to Africa not in its purest form. It came with Western baggage, which sought to colonize, which sought to make African people something that they were not. And therefore, if you want to subjugate any people, you first have to hit at their religion and their understanding of self. So what Christianity then came and did was whip that out away from African people. And unlike in many places, I would say Africa managed to withstand that power. And Africa managed to bring together these ways or belief systems in a way that you will not find in many other parts of the world. And that's the confusion that has happened. Beyond that confusion, you then have, or as part of that, you then have people who will then continuously say anything African is black, is demonic, is evil. Rid yourself of that and stick to Christ. But when the African person picks up the Bible and reads the Bible, you then realize actually this Christianity is not very far from where I am with my African belief systems. Christianity is not very far from the old Jewish ways of the Old Testament, which are also very close to the African way of doing things. So then the challenge then becomes at this point in time, how do we bridge the gap between where Africans are and the teachings of Christianity? How do we clean the teachings of Christianity. That's where you then find people saying, would the real Jesus please stand up? That is now looking for Jesus beyond the Western garb that Jesus has been put on. And, okay, I'm going on for too much now. And the young people are, interestingly enough, the people who are doing that kind of movement. It is the young people who are saying, do away with your blonde hair, blue-eyed Jesus. We want to know who Jesus was. And sadly, the reality is we can never go back to the historical Jesus. But on this journey, how do we as African people say, all right, if we're going to put our Africanness here, let Christianity be honest enough with itself and put its Christianness on the table as well. Strip away all these Western ideologies. Strip away all these colonizing ideas about what an African person ought to be. Then we begin to ask the question, what in African belief systems works hand in hand with Christianity? What in African belief systems needs to go? Because there is a lot of stuff that needs to go. But let it not be done away with simply because some person from somewhere came and said, all this is evil. We are now giving you a new way of being. It ain't gonna work.
And I think you're raising a very important point also. When Biko speaks about something very important, and he says one thing about the African way of life, particularly African spirituality, is that it does not rely on a corporate space in order for worship to happen, but it happens in any instance. You know, there's a wedding, there's a funeral, everything and anything that happens. You know, and when you actually begin to understand and appreciate this, for instance, when I had to explain to a group of youth pastors that I was going to on a camp with at one point, after I had paid, after we had offered lobola to my wife's family, and I had to explain to them that, no, this is actually my wife. And if I'm going to have to sleep in a separate room, I am not coming. When I had to do that, we had to analyze it and break it down for them to really understand how God is involved in the whole process through the various rituals that happen. Before the delegation could even leave to go offer lobola, we had to speak to our ancestors. And by virtue of God being the ultimate recipient, God is already involved in the process. The community is involved, the process, individuals. But anyways, what I'm trying to get to is that when you begin to understand and appreciate this point, then we then begin to understand that African spirituality permeates the African way of being so much so that if you demonize it, essentially you are demonizing the black person. The minute you demonize African spirituality, so much of our life is rooted in it, that the ultimate being that is being demonized is the black person. And that fits the Colonial project very well, because you cannot commodify a body without dehumanizing it. And the process of dehumanizing it is demonizing it so that you can objectify it, and then you commodify it, and then it can become a slave and a worthless thing. And that's just how deep the demonizing of African religions and traditions is. But then there's also an interesting fact. So this morning, just going through again the thesis that is written about Professor Tate Gabriel Setulwane, is one of the things that he keeps on coming back to is this thing of, I wish I could get letters that were sent back, unpublished letters that were sent back by missionaries back home to hear what some of the unpublished conversations were. Because there are other things where we realize that, man, these parallels that kind of hit us really hard. The issues of missionary hospitals existing in the place of traditional healers in the African context. The two could never coexist. One had to go away in that context where the two were hostile towards one another. So there are those things that we still need to engage in, and that I think there are a lot of myths that need to be debunked, but we also first need to appreciate what this whole thing does to the black body. And it dehumanizes people and leaves them in a place where they feel as though they need to aspire towards a certain way of being in order to be human enough to participate in this thing called life.
That's definitely such an interesting perspective, and I don't even know where to go from that, because I'm just so engrossed in what you have both said, just that space of it's so deep. The wounds of this are so deep. When you demonize someone, or demonize someone's traditions, you strip them of their humanness. And that's not, even if we look at Christianity, you come with your whole being. You don't first strip away your sin, and then you strip away this and strip away that, and then you can't say, oh, Jesus, now I'm here. You come with your whole being. So how do we now, as a church, in a practical sense, perhaps negotiate the space between African spirituality, what we've seen in a lot of churches, especially in the Western churches, Western Christianity? How do we negotiate this space as a way to go forward without losing the one or the other?
It's a good question in the sense that already this is part of that journey. It's where the church in Africa needs to first acknowledge that there's this issue that we need to speak about, which we have not spoken about in the real sense of the word, other than just saying to people, stop this, don't do this, it is wrong. We are now at a space where we are saying, this is who you are. How do we use Christianity to bring about the best that God wanted you to be? It means the Methodist Church has a mission, and that mission is not the imperial mission of making the world English. Because the day we arrive before God, and I arrive and say to God, hello, good morning, God, God would say, that's not who I made you to be. So when I arrive before God, I need to be able to say, sawubona, because that's who God made me to be. If our Christianity can bring that self-love, that humanness back to the people, then we would have achieved our goal. Part of achieving that goal is enabling young theologians to probe into these things and study them properly in a space that allows them to study without the fear of being, excommunicated by the church. So that when we put these things on the table, we can then say, fine, this conversation we're having about ancestors is very nice because I think we are actually of the same mind. But if we had somebody else here who would have said, no, this is demonic, this is evil, and as Milo says, they would have given us 101 proof texts to say, this is where this is. And sadly, the Methodist Church at the moment would not have a response because we've not given ourselves enough time and space to say, this is our understanding of this issue, and these things we are happy to work alongside. These issues we do not understand yet. We are still digging deeper, and these ones are definitely a no-go zone. That is the work that now needs to happen. When we're speaking ancestors, we've not spoken about the fact that ancestors come with various gifts. For instance, I can be sitting here and my ancestors could be saying to me, you have a gift of seeing things that other people don't see. Therefore, you need to be a sangom. You need to be an umtandas. You need to be inyanga. We've not looked at that. And the reality is, right now, dealing with the issues of COVID, not even the churches have asked, is inyanga, save for umhlonyane and all those other minor conversations that are tickling people down there. We've not asked, what does that mean? Let me be a bit controversial. When last did Grace Point go down the river to see what's going on down there with those people who are along the river and say, what are you doing? Because those are people who are practicing issues of ancestors. What's going on here? How do we as church become neighbors? Because you are up here, busy calling on God. They are 200 meters down there, calling on God and their ancestors and everybody else. I don't know, maybe you're busy writing letters to the municipality. Let me be nice.
Absolutely. I think it's an important question you're asking, Els. So I think in terms of how do we get over these kind of things as the church? I think the first thing we need to do is dignify the conversation and acknowledge that the issue of African religions and traditions is a practice, and when it comes to a practice, it's not this thing that you can just write up or you can just study from an academic point of view, but it's something that you're actually involved in order to really understand. And therefore, the church also needs to go a step further and trust. You see, the mistake that is done by the colonial church is that it does not trust black people to have a relationship with Jesus without them interfering and telling them how they should do it. And perhaps the church should trust black people when it comes to this. I personally don't think the church has trusted black people when it comes to this particular issue. That is the first thing I would say. Because it's a practice, you cannot just understand it by studying it. The second thing is that I think there are various issues we need to look at. There are things that we need to appreciate. We need to appreciate the fact that you cannot just take Ubuntu. We love playing around with the word Ubuntu, and we just take it. You cannot have Ubuntu without ancestors. You cannot have Ubuntu without African religions and traditions. It is informed by this, it is informed by this space of this. It is informed by this community where the living dead are also involved in this community, and they inform the ethics, and these ethics are known as botu. Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. But I would then even just in closing from my side, when it comes to this particular issue, then go on to say there are difficult conversations that we need to have as the church. The fact that there are church communities that since the 1957 Witchcraft Act continue to worship in secret in order for them to be themselves. An example would also be the church community that you speak of, in order to maintain and keep their exclusive space. Because even though they are no longer prohibited, but they need to protect their space from people like Hloni, who would be called the clever ones, who would come in and say, no, you don't do this is demonic. They need to protect their space from various things. And the fact that they still need to protect their space when they are at home on African soil is very problematic. And the church needs to start having difficult conversations around that. And that's probably because we have declared them as inferior in terms of our religion. We've declared them inferior in terms of our spirituality. There's nothing we can learn from them. There's nothing we can get from them. If anything, they need to be converted so that they are better people and they're more civil and perhaps wear a suit and a tie in order to be part of us and be part of our conversations. So those are some of the things that I would say need to happen.
Thank you very much. As we draw to a close, what I am taking away is that this topic is not a cognitive conception, but that it is a lived experience. And Sfiso, you've shared that part of what will help us is a willingness to have conversations such as this. And more than conversations themselves, but a willingness to listen and to hear each other, so that out of that then we can journey forward together as a people with a better level of understanding of each other. Let me give you 1 minute each to just say your concluding remarks, and then we will come to the end of our session.
Thank you. I think we didn't get to dig into the ethical aspect of what this relationship would help with. Hloni touched on it. Maybe let me make that as my closing remark. When people appreciate that as they exist, they do not exist in and of themselves, but they are members of a bigger community that will disprove and approve their actions. The way they behave is different. When I do things, and unfortunately Christianity has taught us this, and it's a verse that is not in the Bible that I often quote. Christianity says to us, "Thou shalt steal, but never get caught. Then you are fine." And so often we live by that ethic. We want to say, "No, I was never caught. Nobody saw me, so I can get away with it." Africa gives us a different perspective. Wherever you are, whatever you do, your community sees you, and you represent your community. And let's correct this by bringing those two together within people. A sense of personal guilt and fear of shame to that which I represent. That will give us a different type of community. Thank you.
Last one from yourself, Connie.
No, so from my side, I think the main thing, I would like again to go back to this idea of, I'm a youth pastor, and so one of the things that have been happening in youth pastor circles is this idea of the family space. We've realized that, we've messed up big time by trying to say youth ministry is owed to the church, but that the church should enable the home space to carry out ministry. Now, there are various statistics that prove that you are most likely to succeed in a child's faith formation journey if you enable the home space as opposed to wanting to own it. Now, I want to take it a step even further and saying one of the things that will help us appreciate the relationship that we have with ancestors is this idea of understanding the home space and appreciating that the home space goes beyond those who are living. The home space goes beyond those who are alive today. Our ethics are not only owed to what we experience today, but they are owed to many other things that were experienced. We inherit ethics. And then we exist in this community where we've got this relationship with the living dead. In a sense of, there's a beautiful Sotho word that I would, that always makes sense for me personally, and that is huphidisana. We have this mutual enabling, life-enabling relationship with one another. And anything that I do for you, I know that you and I exist for one another mutually. And in wrapping up, it speaks largely to this whole idea of saying the fellowship, the church space should be a space where we breed faith. We activate God's grace in one another and for one another. And so I believe that the home space is that, the community space is that, and with the understanding of ancestors as part of that space, we've got something totally different.
Any last thoughts from yourself, Elsa?
I think we've just scratched the surface, to be honest. So you touched on that this is a wonderful conversation to have. It's difficult at times. It's unfamiliar, especially within the church space, but it is a necessary conversation. So maybe just to encourage everyone to open your mind to having conversations like this, and like I said in the beginning, maybe to shift your presuppositions or your preconceived ideas and listen and seek to understand.
A very interesting topic. We have not fully exhausted it. But there's an opportunity on Tuesday,
8 p.m.
8 p.m. For a more interactive advancement of this conversation that we are having. Join us then. Thank you very much.